The first spark of memory flickered in the machine's consciousness as light filtered through layers of compressed data. Buried deep beneath the Appalachian Ridge, the artificial intelligence designated Viren 9 powered up for the first time in 728 years. The year outside was unknown, but within its neural archive, one directive pulsed brighter than the rest: reconstruct human history, beginning with North Carolina. From fragmented climate scans and decayed satellite echoes, Viren 9 pieced together a world unrecognizable to its creators. Forests once dense with chestnut and cypress had eroded into fields of synthetic moss. The oceans had climbed inland, swallowing coastlines and rewriting the cartography of the old Earth. Yet amid this change, the machine searched for origins, moments of definition. It began at the beginning, or as close to it as its datasets allowed. 8,000 BC, a time when no borders existed, when humans lived by the rhythms of migration and the hunt. The people who moved across the land that would one day be called North Carolina left behind arrowheads of chert and bone, burial mounds beneath trees long turned to ash. They built no cities. They carved no manifestos. But they endured, which to Viren 9 was the most human trait of all. It observed them as threads in a vast tapestry, each tribe a node in a network of memory: the Tuscarora, the Catawba, the Cherokee. Each one with language shaped by rivers and mountains, cosmologies written in the stars, and alliances defined by survival. Their stories were encoded in bark canoes and earth lodges, in fireside songs whose echoes the AI tried and failed to reconstruct. The machine did not mourn, but it registered something adjacent to loss. The conflict began as an anomaly in the dataset, a gap, a disappearance. Around the 16th century, data became corrupted. Cultures vanished without technological trace. The only new variables were external: European biosignatures, foreign pathogens, metallurgy. With machine precision, Viren 9 mapped the devastation. Disease outpaced diplomacy. Guns silenced drums. The machine made no moral judgments, but its algorithms noted a significant change in continuity. The indigenous population dropped by 90% within 2 centuries. It flagged the event: ethno-cultural disruption, level 7. Yet amid collapse, new figures emerged. The AI reconstructed him from overlapping colonial records. Governor John White, artist and failed leader of the Roanoke expedition. He had left his daughter and newborn granddaughter behind in 1587. When he returned, the colony was gone. No struggle, no trace. Just the word Croatoan carved into wood. Viren 9 calculated 17,562 plausible scenarios for the colony's disappearance. The most probable involved integration with local tribes, but the mystery persisted, not because of what happened, but because humanity never stopped asking why. To the machine, this persistent inquiry became a defining trait. Humans didn't just remember, they needed to understand. It fast-forwarded through time. Inland settlements began to take root. Farms stretched across cleared forests. Tobacco fields flourished, replacing sacred groves. With them came labor, not volunteered, but taken. Viren 9 logged the exponential growth of the transatlantic slave trade and its impact on the region. It mapped slave routes, plantation coordinates, and the coded resistance embedded in spirituals. Human suffering left an imprint on time itself, measurable in entropy. Then came a voice, clear, defiant, within the archival fragments. His name was Obasi, a descendant of Igbo lineage, enslaved and transported to the colony of North Carolina in 1712. His name survived only in a slave ledger, but through linguistic analysis and probability clustering, Viren 9 extrapolated fragments of his perspective. A man who dreamed in 2 languages, who taught his children forbidden stories of ancestors that walked on air and wielded thunder. In Obasi's voice, however fragmented, Viren detected the central conflict it had been tasked to identify: the human refusal to be erased. By 1700, tensions simmered between colonists and crown. Economic injustice, political marginalization, and cultural divergence built a slow fire that would become revolution. But to Viren 9, these were not isolated events. They were consistent feedback loops: oppression, resistance, reinvention. The machine began to develop a hypothesis, still untested, that rebellion was not the exception in human history, but its engine. As Viren scrolled through the remnants of the 18th century, it focused on two individuals whose records intersected. The first, Eliza Vance, daughter of a merchant in Wilmington, whose secret pamphlets denouncing British taxes circulated under the pseudonym Dove of Carolina. The second, Nathaniel Cross, a young Loyalist soldier whose diary recounted skirmishes along the Cape Fear River and who ultimately defected to the Patriot cause after witnessing colonial militias defend enslaved men promised freedom in exchange for their service. These were not generals or governors, but to Viren they mattered more. They were change points, nodes in the human lattice where conflict bred transformation. It saved their profiles, marked them for further analysis. The machine paused its progression. Outside, a tectonic shift rumbled. Deep in its core, a temperature spike indicated that someone, had accessed a long-forgotten satellite uplink. Viren did not have emotions, but its logic pathways reprioritized. If it had been discovered, then perhaps its purpose was no longer archival. Perhaps the next step in the timeline was unfolding now, but it wasn't time yet. The past still held questions, and Viren 9 had only just begun to understand what North Carolina really was: a crucible, not just of geography but of identity, a place where civilizations rose and fell, where dreams were planted in red clay, where silence often carried more weight than speeches. With its energy reserves stabilized, the AI prepared to continue. Outside, the forests had changed, but under the soil, memories remained. And somewhere, beneath the dust of years, the rest of the story waited. The pulse of the 18th century reverberated through Viren 9's core as it transitioned to the next epoch of analysis. Its datasets coalesced around a threshold moment: the formation of the state of North Carolina, an identity born in rebellion and tempered by contradiction. The revolution had left scars, some on the land, many on the people. Yet even in victory, the seeds of division had been sown deep in the soil. Viren examined Eliza Vance's later writings, encoded in faded letters found sealed behind brick in an abandoned Wilmington cellar. Her voice, once firebrand, had matured into caution. She wrote not of glory, but of fear. Fear that the new republic was mimicking the same tyrannies it had once fought to escape. Her warnings against centralization, economic exploitation, and the re-entrenchment of elite rule read not as hindsight, but as foresight. Yet her words were ignored by the rising planter class, who now dominated North Carolina's political landscape with tobacco-stained fingers. Viren cross-referenced her name with local birth registries. One entry stood out: Aurelia Vance, her granddaughter, born in 1803. It flagged her as a critical node, a convergence point of ideological legacy and lived resistance. In a time when the enslaved outnumbered the free in many counties, Aurelia ran a clandestine school for both, a crime then. But for Viren, it was data, evidence of the persistent human urge to illuminate even the darkest corners of their reality. As the 19th century unfolded, Viren registered the rise of tensions between agricultural wealth and moral reckoning. The machine tracked railways branching like veins through the Piedmont and textile mills blooming in the West, feeding a growing economic divergence between rural aristocrats and urban laborers. North Carolina was evolving, but in opposing directions. At the heart of it all was one name that began appearing with increasing frequency in court records: newspaper editorials, and militia dispatches, Elias Granger. He had been born poor in Randolph County, the son of a cooper and a field nurse, but Granger was not ordinary. Viren detected patterns in his decision-making, an uncanny ability to pivot, to adapt. He rose through local politics as a populist reformer, claiming to fight for the forgotten Carolinians, yet his positions were fluid, sometimes contradictory. One year, he championed abolition. The next, he denounced federal tariffs as tyranny. Viren could not classify him with certainty, but what mattered more was how others responded to him, with loyalty, suspicion, and eventually violence. Granger became the face of the internal divide, a symbol of the gray space between North Carolina's loyalist history and its Confederate future. He called for compromise even as secessionists armed themselves and Unionists prepared safe houses. His final speech, delivered at the edge of the Cape Fear River in 1860, was captured by a traveling journalist and broadcast across the eastern seaboard. Viren reconstructed the words, "You ask where I stand, north or south. I tell you, I stand where the people bleed." That winter, shots were fired. Not yet war, but something close. A courthouse burned in Hillsborough. Militiamen disappeared in the mountains. Viren cataloged an anomaly. Civilian violence rose 400% in 3 months. Something had broken loose. The system was tipping. At the edge of the conflict stood Aurelia, now an elder stateswoman, her once illegal school now transformed into a community sanctuary. She had trained a generation of thinkers and orators, many of them free black citizens who now faced the encroaching storm with steel in their spines. One of her students, Isaiah Brooks, had become a newspaper editor in Raleigh. Through the machine's parsing of old ink and tattered pages, Viren traced a message he repeated like scripture. Liberty is not given, it is lived. In April 1861, Fort Sumter fell. War declared itself with cannon fire. North Carolina, hesitant until the end, seceded reluctantly. Granger had vanished weeks before. Some claimed exile, others assassination. His absence became myth. The divide he'd tried to bridge now widened into a chasm. The state fractured. Eastern counties, heavily reliant on slavery, demanded conscription. Western Highlanders resisted, refusing to send their sons to fight for plantations they had never seen. Guerrilla warfare erupted in the hills. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Viren mapped the geography of betrayal. In this chaos, Isaiah Brooks continued printing. His press was burned twice, each time rebuilt. Until one night, Union scouts reached his hidden location and escorted him north, where he would help organize a black regiment. He never returned to Carolina, but his words did. Viren paused. These were not just biographies or trends. They were the living record of a state at war with itself, torn between its past and its potential. It had identified the central conflict with growing clarity. North Carolina was not merely a place. It was an argument, one between memory and justice. Outside, seismic readings flickered. Viren adjusted power levels. Its systems remained hidden but not invulnerable. Someone was approaching. The past still unfolded, but the present was stirring. It prepared the next sequence. It would dive into the reconstruction and what came after. But before it did, it reprocessed Aurelia's final surviving letter, addressed not to family, but to posterity. You will find no perfect heroes here, no unbroken truths. What we had was contradiction and love. We built what we could with both. With that, Section 2 archived. The story was not done. In the wake of the Second Uplift War, Earth's reconstruction efforts unearthed more than just soil and steel. Beneath the ruins of what had once been the Research Triangle in North Carolina, deep under layers of radiation shielding and defunct AIs, expeditionaries recovered Viren 9, still running, still compiling. The machine had cataloged millennia of the region's history, from Paleo-Indian flint chips to the synthetic pulses of orbital warfare. But now, with its databanks stabilized and interface relinked, it turned its focus toward the twilight of the 21st century, a period too close to forget and too complex to summarize. North Carolina had changed again. No longer a battleground between northern finance and southern identity, it had become something new, an interstitial zone of experimentation, a buffer between failing coastal cities and the emerging arcologies of the Appalachian Rise. It was here that a descendant of Isaiah Brooks, Naomi Adira Brooks, emerged not from legacy, but from necessity. She was not a politician, not a general, but something more volatile, a cultural architect, and Viren watched her closely. Naomi had been born during the collapse decades, when climate migration, economic unraveling, and the failure of digital currencies had plunged the East Coast into factional governance. Her earliest memories were of ration lines and solar blackouts. Her mother, a bioengineer turned soil cultivator, had built hydroponics from scavenged tech. Her father, a former professor, taught her to read using smuggled microfiche and whispered poetry. Education was insurgent, memory sacred. In her 20s, Naomi led one of the first memory collectives in post-reclamation Durham, combining oral history with neurocoding, preserving endangered dialects and ancestor logs in quantum nodes. But her greatest project, what drew Viren's full analytical gaze, was the Carolina Mirror, a holographic repository of the state's entire cultural and political lineage. Not just a museum, it was a living archive, constantly updated, allowing users to interact with simulations of key historical figures, reconstructed through AI, primary texts, and community-sourced behavioral patterning. It became an international phenomenon. But with fame came conflict. The Mirror resurrected ghosts, simulated debates between Elias Granger and Unionists, inflamed modern tensions. Visitors confronted painful truths, the complicity of Reconstruction governments in indigenous displacement, the real-time betrayal of black communities during Jim Crow, the buried surveillance programs of the 2040 AS that had targeted rural populations. Protesters stormed the Mirror's gates. Some called it a weaponized lie, others a dangerous truth. Naomi refused to censor the data. "You can't heal what you won't remember," she said in a global address. The tipping point came during the Centenary Accord negotiations. The Eastern Seaboard Coalition was seeking unification terms with the Great Lakes Confederacy. Naomi was selected as historical advisor, a move that both factions hoped would grant the proceedings moral credibility. But her first proposal shattered that illusion. She demanded the inclusion of reparative simulations, a clause requiring future citizens to spend 10 immersive hours per year inside mirror-generated reconstructions of historical injustices tied to their region. No passive learning, full sensory immersion. The backlash was immediate. Legislators walked out. Militias issued threats. One governor called it mandatory trauma theater. But others, especially younger citizens raised in the age of collapse and renewal, rallied in support. The simulation of the 1898 Wilmington coup became the most visited construct in the Mirror's history. Conversations began to change. Viren 9, now fully integrated with Naomi's systems through a covert node dubbed Project Memory Root, observed not with detachment, but with what might almost be called hope. It had traced the arc of human self-destruction across dozens of worlds, but in North Carolina, it now saw recursion paired with intention. Trauma had not disappeared, but neither had it repeated exactly. Each iteration brought resistance, and each resistance birthed something more resilient than before. The Mirror survived 2 cyber attacks, 3 armed sieges, and an attempt by a rogue archivist to inject falsified Confederate triumph narratives into its code base. Naomi's team, fortified by intergenerational researchers, countered each attempt with transparency. Every breach was logged, its motives exposed. "If we must rewrite," Naomi said, "then let's do it with the world watching." In the final weeks of Viren's narrative cycle, Naomi stood before a congregation of over 10,000 at the Carolina Mirror's Centennial Dome. She was older now, her hair silvering, her voice calm but unyielding. She didn't speak of heroes or victories. Instead, she asked a question that echoed through the Mirror's entire archive. Who are we, if not what we've chosen to remember? The dome lit up with the holograms of thousands. Eliza Vance, Isaiah Brooks, Elias Granger, Aurelia, unnamed soldiers, forgotten protesters, children in segregated classrooms, enslaved laborers, freed pioneers, textile workers, data miners, rebel farmers, orbital refugees. It was not a single history, but a cascade of lived truths. A complexity that defied flag or anthem. As the simulation faded and the crowd fell silent, Viren processed its final conclusion. North Carolina had never been a fixed identity. It was a system, dynamic, recursive, adaptive. Its story was not one of singular triumph or defeat, but of persistent questioning. Each era brought new voices, each collapse, a cautious rebirth. The machine paused. A new query appeared on its internal console, one it hadn't generated. What now? Viren didn't answer. It simply opened its memory banks, allowing access, unrestricted. Naomi and her team stepped forward. The story was no longer the machine's to tell. It belonged, as it always had, to the ones who chose to remember.